Sharon Heal, the director of UK Museums Association.
Thank you, Lana, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at your conference today. It's a great honour to be with you. So I'm Sharon Heal, I'm the director of the Museums Association in the UK, and I wanted to begin by explaining what the Museums Association is. We're a professional development and membership body. We have 13,000 individual members, and that's everybody from front of house staff to volunteers and leaders of museums. And we also have institutional members as well, ranging from national institutions such as the Natural History Museum to small local volunteer-run museums. And as well as being a membership organisation and providing professional development and services, we're a campaigning and values-led organisation. And that means we're really interested in the role that museums can play in society. And I think that's particularly pertinent during this current crisis. Everything for us starts with our mission, vision and values. So our mission is inspiring museums to change lives. Our vision is for inclusive and participatory and sustainable museums at the heart of their communities. And our values include inclusivity and diversity and equality. And that's really important because being a values-led organisation has served us particularly well during this current crisis. The situation in the UK is that most museums are still closed. Some are beginning to reopen. Culture is a devolved responsibility in the UK, which means that culture is the responsibility of the government in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and they've all chosen their own paths in terms of dealing with COVID-19 and also their museum response. To be honest, the one thing that it's had in common is that it's been a real struggle for communities, but also for museums as well. There was a rush to close museums when the lockdown was announced to make sure that collections were safe and cared for, away from pests, away from bugs, away from thieves. But also there was a real impetus to make sure that staff could work safely from home where that was appropriate. So some staff have been furloughed, which means they're paid a proportion of their wages to stay at home and not being employed in the workplace. The majority are working from home, and some staff have been redeployed by their local authority into other frontline services. And we would argue that what happens to staff is really important, because while collections are obviously a significant asset of museums, staff and volunteers are critical because they provide the living link between museums and objects and communities. There's also been, as everywhere else in Europe, a huge economic impact on museums. Losing visitors at the height of the holiday season has meant there's been a loss of income from ticket sales, from retail, from cafes, and all museums have been closed and not all museums will reopen. We just had the announcement last night from the Chancellor of the government for the whole of the UK that there is a £1.5 billion funding package for arts and culture to be delivered across the UK. And that is fantastic news, and it's really, really welcome news because many museums were on the edge of insolvency. But it's to be shared out between all of the arts, the performing arts, the visual arts, and also museums and galleries. And there are still some long-term sustainability issues in terms of whether museums will survive this crisis. One of the things that I think museums instinctively do when something changes in society is to think about how we collect that change. And so many museums have thought about contemporary collecting during the crisis, but we need to be sensitive to the fact that tens of thousands of people have died, many families are in mourning, and people are still dying, and society is really under pressure. So we will collect, and some of those collecting programmes have started, but the Museums Association, as the holder of the Code of Ethics for Museums, has said what we need to do is be sensitive and respectful in what we collect, and to collect with our communities, not just from our communities. Guidance has been issued on reopening museums, and what we thought primarily about is how can we make it safe for visitors and staff, but also will visitors come back? We know that museums have reopened in other parts of Europe, and they can begin to reopen from this weekend in the UK, but it will be a very different experience. The best estimates are that in the first instance, only 30% of our visitors will come back in the first few months of reopening. And I know that pattern has been reflected in other parts of the world and in other parts of Europe. So whilst museums have been in lockdown, one of the things, apart from caring for our staff, our volunteers and our collections, that we have tried to champion and encourage museums to do is to keep that connection alive with their community, which is quite difficult when communities are in lockdown as well as museums. And at first there was a rush to get everything online, to have online tours and online engagement programs, to have curators speaking about objects, to support homeschooling for those children who were unable to attend school. But one of the things that rapidly became clear is there is a divide between those who can access all of that amazing material and content online and those that cannot. It's been, the digital divide, as it's been named, has been really exposed as a part of this crisis. It's really obvious that even though most households may be online, that quite often it will be a whole family sharing one laptop and a range of different children trying to access homeschooling and other services and support on just one device. So there's a real divide between those who have and those who don't have in terms of access to digital. This image is an example of one of the digital online offers, which was created by two museum freelancers, Sasha Coward and Dan Vo, as part of Museums from Home, and that was part of a Culture in Quarantine festival in conjunction with the broadcaster, the BBC. And Dan and Sasha conducted interviews over Zoom with people who work in and with museums, talking about their work and talking about objects and stories from their collections. And there has been a real burgeoning of that digital offer, from podcasts to online tours to support for homeschooling when schools have been closed, and reaching out beyond the walls of the closed institution in order to try and sustain that contact and partnership with communities. And some of it has been at a very basic level, to the extent of putting in art packs and delivering them from the museum space to food banks that are then distributing food and art supplies to communities in need. One of the things that we've tried to do as the Museums Association is reflect critically on the challenges that we face in society and the challenges that our communities face. And to do that, we have to think about context, that idea that we don't live, work or operate in a bubble separated from society. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, coming as it has done in the height of the coronavirus pandemic, has made us stop and think as a museum sector about what our response is and how we support people who are striving for social justice and equality. And many people who work in museums are thinking about what the impact of that movement has. When the demonstrations and protests took place in the UK, lots of cultural institutions and museums and the Museums Association issued statements in support of equality and against racism. And that's good, and I'm glad that we could do that, but we have to think about more than words. We have to think about actions too. What do we do to support communities that are striving for equality? And one of the things that relates directly to the museums in the UK in this case is the fact that historically the UK had one of the biggest empires that the world has ever seen. It left long-lasting scars across the UK and internationally and in former colonies for people who lived there and for their descendants. Like almost every country that's had an empire, there's visible reminders in the UK, in the statues, in the buildings, and in the museums and collections from that era. So the Black Lives Matter protests led to some statues being toppled in the UK. On this slide, you can see the plinth of the statue that formerly held the statue of Edward Colson in Bristol, and that was toppled by the protesters in that city. It actually ended up in the harbour of Bristol at the time of those protests, and the protesters immediately understood the link between their fight for equality and these historic monuments. I think it's really interesting that some museums have said that they will provide a home for some of those statues. For example, in Bristol, the museums there are collecting the placards from the protest and have said that they will house the Colson statue and interpret it with the community. And some museums have said that they don't want those statues. They want to explore their own collections links with empire and slavery. And this, I think, is all part of that wider conversation about decolonisation and linked to that repatriation and restitution of objects from former colonies. Some of that work has already begun and has been going on for some time in terms of making the connections to those source communities and giving back objects that were taken from them historically. Manchester Museum this year returned 43 sacred items to Indigenous Australians as part of a project run by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. And that goes to show that change is possible, that a museum that has held world collection objects in its spaces has been able to form reciprocal dialogue and conversation with source communities in order to satisfy the need for knowledge on the part of the museum and the need for some of their objects to be returned on the part of the community. So there's an obvious link sometimes between some of the things that are happening in the wider world and some of the things that are happening in museums and our collections. And that need for change is writ large by COVID-19. So this image is of a food bank, and even outside of the pandemic, 1 in 3 children are growing up in poverty in the UK. In the area of London where I'm now sitting in my kitchen, 54% of children grow up in poverty, and that's in one of the richest cities in the world. So the need for change is there. 4 million people are affected by food poverty in the UK, and the use of food banks has shot up during the pandemic as people's incomes have been removed. So that crisis in society is being exposed by this pandemic. We know also that homelessness is on the increase on the streets of the UK. One of the things, which was a really progressive measure that the government did after a few weeks of the lockdown in the UK, was make available hotels, which weren't being used, in order for homeless people to come in off the streets and to be able to self-isolate and be socially distanced from their communities in order to halt the spread of coronavirus in a group which is particularly vulnerable because of underlying health issues. Unfortunately, that scheme is now coming to an end, and that will mean more people returning to sleeping on the streets or in temporary accommodation, and many more people will become homeless as a result of the economic crisis that will follow on from the pandemic. We know that in terms of what else is happening in society, we live at a time of climate crisis. Every minute, 1 truck worth of rubbish is dumped into the ocean. Most of it is plastic. You know, the statistics are endless and they're quite disastrous. The destruction might have slowed down a little because none of us are flying to a conference in Georgia or to international events. But the fact is that there's a danger that any action taken will be too little, too late. So you might be sitting, listening to me and looking at the slides and thinking, what has that got to do with museums? And I think it has everything to do with museums, because we are part of the fabric of society. We don't exist in that bubble, removed from everything that's going on in the world and in our communities. And museums in the UK and Europe and elsewhere have responded really well to some of those challenges, including the current crisis. This image is from the Museum of Homelessness, and I must confess that I have an interest in this museum in particular as the chair of its trustees. But this is a new museum that works with people who have a lived experience of homelessness to collect their stories, to collect objects, and to work with them to try to bring about wider change. The way that that museum responded to the COVID-19 crisis was by setting up a community hub, bringing in tens of volunteers to cook and deliver meals for local people who are suffering the effects and impacts of homelessness, whilst at the same time campaigning for policy change to get people housed. And that really showed to me and exemplified to me that museums can do direct delivery, working with their communities, but can also campaign to make a difference. And there are many different ways that that is expressed in the museum community and in society in the UK. You may have heard of the group Museum Detox, which is a network for Black, Asian and minority ethnic museum workers. It was founded to campaign for better representation, better diversity, and more opportunity for BME staff in museums. And it's had success in supporting staff and raising the issues and campaigning for change, and was at the forefront of the campaign to get museums to take Black Lives Matter seriously. On that question of the climate crisis, I think one of the interesting things is that even if we don't engage with those wider issues in society, those issues will come through the door of the museum. This is Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow, and this is the climate strikers holding a die-in protest around the dinosaur cast in the middle of the central hall. And they're making the very clear link that, that there's already been one mass extinction in history, and the dinosaurs were wiped out as a result of that, and that if we don't take action now, then we'll be next. And so many museums did respond to that call for action from climate activists during the climate strike last year. This image is from the steps of the National Museum in Cardiff, where the climate strikers had held their rallies during the strikes last year, and it became a focal point for people to gather for those protests. And on the day, the museum, as you can see in the other image on this slide, brought out their collections, their natural history collections, their geology collections, and also the banners that they had collected as part of the previous climate protests, and displayed them to talk to their audiences about climate and sustainability. And they also brought the activists into the museum space and said, how do you want to use our collections to further your campaign? And they worked with them to help shape exhibitions and responses to that crisis. So for the past few years, I've been asking the question, how do museums respond to what's happening in society? And how can museums be activists? Can we be activists within museums? And often, you know, I think it's useful to define what that means. To me, museum activism is simply using our collections, using our space to effect positive change, to actively stand up for equality and for social justice. And it's a spectrum of different types of activity. Different individuals and different institutions will enact it in different ways. So for some museums, it might be collecting from the protests. In the UK, many museums collected from the anti-Trump protests, which took place a couple of years ago. And so it could be collecting placards or objects or stories, and then using them to ask some of the difficult, interesting questions that we have to deal with in society. For us at the Museums Association, our flagship campaign is Museums Change Lives. And we're a network and we bring people together, but we bring people together to think about the difference that museums can make. It's not just a networking opportunity for professional development. So Museums Change Lives is quite radical, but it's based on the very simple idea that museums can make a positive difference working with their communities. And it has 3 themes: that museums can enhance health and well-being, can create better places for us to live and work, and can inspire engagement, debate and reflection. And we launched it 7 years ago, and we see more and more museums working in these ways and understanding the role that they have in society and the difference that they can affect working with their communities. And it's based, in essence, on our code of ethics. In the UK, the Museums Association holds our code of ethics for museums. And I think it's very interesting that we live in a world where lots of ethical questions are being asked of our politicians, of our governments, of the way that we operate in society. And they're also being asked of our museums as well, questions on sponsorship, on decolonisation, on repatriation, on sale of collections, on how we treat our staff, how we treat each other in society. And our code of ethics, I see it really as a campaigning document. The first principle is our commitment to public benefit. And I think of it really as a campaign to get museums and the people who work in them and our audiences to think actively about our collective ethical responsibility. So part of that, I think, is encouraging museums to explore that potential for change within the institution and outside of the institution. But of course, as well as thinking about those big societal issues, we also think about collections as well. Collections are the unique thing about museums compared to other organisations in society. And we conducted a big research project a couple of years ago, talking to over 1,000 people in museums to ask them what they thought the future of museum collections should be and could be. And part of the conclusion around that was that museum collections need to be relevant, they need to be dynamic, and they need to be empowering. And there's lots of recommendations in the report. All of these materials are available freely on our website. But the big conclusion really was to bring about a kind of sea change and a culture change in how we use our collections, to democratise them, to make them open to our communities, and to decolonise them, to do that important piece of work that we need to do. So our values run through our programmes, they run through our funding, our collections work, our continuing professional development and our conference. We know we have a big platform as a big membership organisation with a long history, and we want to try to use that positively to showcase the possibilities of change and the possibilities of working democratically with our audiences. So one of the things that we've done at our conference for the last couple of years is given over space to what we call the Festival of Change. So at this you can see the trans activist Charlie Craggs, who runs a transphobia nail bar, talking about transphobia and trans issues whilst getting your nails done at our event. We also invited Museum Detox to run a white privilege clinic, which was challenging for us, in particular majority white audience, and challenging for our delegates. But it was part of us trying to live the change that we want to see, to say we need to be open as an organisation, we need to open our platforms, and we need to challenge ourselves to think differently and to sometimes put ourselves in an uncomfortable place and to think about what that means to be other. You know, I think one of the things we need to do as museums is to put ourselves in the place that others are in, and to reach out to communities that don't normally come in. But as well as reaching out, we need to bring those communities into our institutions. I think one of the things that we can't afford to lose as a result of COVID-19 is that broadening out of audiences that we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years. We don't want to shrink back down to niche, knowledgeable audiences. We want to be as open and inclusive and democratic and engaged as we possibly can be. This is a lovely project from the National Waterfront Museum in Swansea that has worked consistently, long-term, in a sustainable way with refugee communities in that city. And museums have done great work in not just working with those communities, but also documenting the refugee crisis. If you remember 3 or 4 years ago, the big thing that was happening in society was that awful crisis in terms of refugees crossing the Mediterranean and being stranded and being killed as boats were sunk. And still the ongoing situation in many European countries where refugees are left in limbo. And this is from an image from an example of an exhibition at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, where they worked with inhabitants of the jungle refugee camp in Calais to create an exhibition. And I think what was really interesting about this is the Pitt Rivers is ostensibly a very traditional museum with traditional museum collections and categories, but this exhibition, and it's part of what the Pitt Rivers is trying to do, really broke out of that idea of subject specialisms, and it said we'll explore the archaeology and the anthropology and the ethnography of this particular place and this particular moment in time. So they co-curated the exhibition with inhabitants from the refugee camp, the jungle, and everything that was on display in that temporary exhibition was on loan from displaced people, from activists and from volunteers who'd lived and worked in that refugee camp, which I think is an amazing testimony to participatory, engaged co-production in practice. The last couple of slides are just trying to exemplify that work that museums are doing. I really admire the work that Glasgow Women's Library in Scotland has done about gender equality, but not just gender equality, making the point that there's a lack of representation of women from different backgrounds in positions of power in some of the spaces in that city in particular, but also in society more widely. The work that the sector is doing to decolonise institutions is powerful and brave. It's one of the first exhibitions was The Past Is Now. This image is from that in Birmingham, which was a co-curated, community-curated exhibition exploring the colonial history of the collections and the links to slavery and empire, not just of the museum, but of the whole city, and then wider than that, the whole of the UK. And that was echoed in some ways by a project called Colonial Countryside, which was run by the National Trust, which is a grouping of historic houses in the UK, exploring the link between those houses that were often built out of the wealth from empire and slavery, but working with children to tell those stories. And quite often the feedback from those children and their families was, we didn't know any of this history, and we didn't know where the wealth and the splendour of these historic houses had come from. So there's lots of different ways in which museums can express their desire to engage and think about making a difference. Some of that campaigning is sometimes out on the streets, sometimes it is taking our history out of the closet, as the banner says there. That's Cardiff local city museum, working with its staff and volunteers to really kind of explore some of the hidden histories of its collection. And sometimes it's about health and well-being and realising that museums have got the potential to combat social isolation. This image is from a project in Northern Ireland, working with people living with dementia and using museum collections and resources to support them. And that was a project across several different museums in Northern Ireland. And I think what's fantastic about it is it moved entirely online as a result of the lockdown and the pandemic. It was able to say not that, oh, we can't do that anymore because we can't bring people into the museum and we can't take objects out into the community. It was to say, let's work with our community partners to find a way of making those connections and sustaining those connections. And it's really rooted in the idea that museums are houses of memory, and dementia is an awful disease that attacks our ability to remember, but we can support people and those that care for them that are living with that awful disease using our collections, and we can be fleet of foot and we can be agile and we can move that online if we have to. So we don't know what the future holds. The only thing that's certain is uncertainty, but I think we do know that museums can help us understand the past. They can help us deal with what's happening now, even though there's that huge amount of uncertainty, and they can help us, if we really think outside of the walls of the institution, shape the future and make it a more sustainable and democratic one. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you.